fish much better than crud. I like birds and things, creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes! Good morning, Toledo, and good afternoon, Columbus, and hello to those of you listening on the internet, wherever and whenever you are. My name is Joe DeMare, and the name of this show is For a Green Future. For a Green Future is a program where we talk about ecology and the environment. We talk about them in the ways that they affect you, your wealth, your health, your happiness, the happiness and health of your friends and families and pets and all the critters around you, the squirrels and the birds and pretty much just everything. And we like to do it with your help. This is a call-in show. Call in at any time in the next hour at 866-240-1065. That's 866-240-1065 to talk about any kind of environmental issue that you would like. And this program, as we got a good show lined up for you today, we have a interview coming up at about quarter after with Joshua Pearce, who is a professor at Michigan Technical University, and he's going to be talking about the economics of rooftop solar, putting solar panels on your house. Turns out when you do that, you're not just helping yourself economically, you're helping everybody in your neighborhood, and he's got the statistics and the numbers on how that exactly works. We're going to be joined shortly, hopefully, by my co-host, Rebecca Wood, and she's going to be talking a little bit later on about Theodore Roosevelt. Let's see, then we have, of course, at the bottom of the hour, we're going to hear from our terrific advertisers and patrons, and some interesting news going along with that. And then we'll have environmental news and ecological information coming up. And as I said, hopefully we'll hear from you at 866-240-1065. And it's a kind of a gray morning here, this February 28th, the last day of February. And as I was getting ready for the show, a flock of geese flew over the house. And just a reminder that, spring is coming. We're going to have green grass again pretty soon here. And we did have a little bout here with an actual winter, but this little stretch of cold that we had this couple of weeks here, that for our younger listeners, that actually used to be sort of the norm around here all the way from December through February. I mean, we've had 2 weeks of actual hard winter, which is, enough to make you want spring, no question there. But I remember it used to be different, and that, this is not just an old man talking. This is backed up by actual facts and figures and the experience of a lot of listeners. So if you're somebody who's listening and you're younger, let's say you're in your teens still, try to imagine what just happened over the last 2 weeks, happening all the way back, starting in, it could start in late November. It was not unusual to have a snowy Thanksgiving and then go all the way through till March, because the saying used to be, March comes in like a lion and goes out like a lamb. And I'd say right now March is sort of coming in about like a feral house cat. Not exactly a lion. There's still snow on the ground, but mostly it's melted now. And but it's going to warm up, definitely. Don't worry. Spring is on the way, and there's signs like the Canada geese going by, and the walleye run is starting around here. This is for our out of Toledo area listeners. Walleye run's a really big deal on the Maumee River, and we're probably going to do a show on that very shortly. But it is the 28th of February, which is the last official day of Black History Month. And so I did want to talk just a little bit about a fellow by the name of Charles Young. And Charles Young, he's not a really well-known environmentalist, but he was quite a historical figure. He was actually born in slavery in 1864, March 12th, 1864. And he actually was the third African-American graduate from West Point Academy, because he was able to get into West Point because his father had joined the Union Army during the Civil War. And he went on. He was the first black national parks superintendent. So the parks, it's not widely known, or remembered, but between 1891 and 1913, the Army was the administrator, the U.S. Army was the administrator of the national parks. And so he was, as a military commander, he was in charge of the parks. And he is the one who preserved Sequoia National Park and Yellowstone National Park. So the fact that there's still some buffalo around, because as we know, wild buffalo were hunted to near extinction. There was just one wild herd left in Yellowstone, and he is the one who preserved that herd by protecting the park. And he also preserved the giant sequoia trees in Sequoia National Park, because what was happening up until he took over, it was kind of, the parks were being looked at by the local population kind of the way you would look at the common or the commons, which basically just meant that it was a free-for-all, that everybody said, oh, that's a park, oh, let's go get some firewood. It was socially acceptable to just take whatever resources were there for yourself without having to pay for any of it, or without having to have any regard for what the park itself needed to stay sustained. And so had he not come along, all the sequoias would have been cut down. We would not have any sequoias. All the buffalo would have been hunted. There would not be any wild buffalo stock. His instrument, the way he managed to do this, to enforce this, was through the use of the Buffalo Soldiers. And the Buffalo Soldiers are also an important part of Black history. They were all black regiments and patrols in the U.S. Army, and there were six segregated regiments, and that was consolidated into four: the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry. And the Buffalo Soldiers are remembered for fighting in the Indian Wars. They helped defeat militarily the Apaches and the Comanches. They were extremely, everyone was impressed with their ability to fight, and they were used by the Army to suppress the Native Americans who were trying to come off the reservations because the treaties had been broken. And so it came down to brute force, and the Buffalo Soldiers were a big part of that force. But they also had the duty of protecting these national parks. And so they protected them. There were all kinds of poaching going on there, all kinds of, the white farmers around the parks would graze their sheep in the parks. And sheep grazing is perhaps one of the most environmentally destructive forms of raising livestock. And so they had to be very diplomatic at the same time, because they were still, this was, the late 1800s, early 1900s, and racism was not just rampant, racism was everywhere. And so these Buffalo Soldiers, these black regiments, they had the guns, they had the horses, they were the soldiers, but they couldn't just force everybody out. They had to be diplomatic about it, because it was not unusual at that time for black people to be murdered, lynched, and killed just for being too, quote unquote, uppity, which is a horrible stain on American history. But somehow the Buffalo Soldiers managed to wend through that. They walked that tightrope, and they both protected the national parks and the resources, and they kept them. They kept the white settlers around them from wiping them out. So, and they earned, as militarily, they earned the respect of everyone back then. They were widely recognized as incredibly fierce fighters, and it's just a very illuminating part of black history. And Charles Young is the man that we have to thank for the Sequoias and for creating the Buffalo Soldiers. And back in 2013, his house was made part of the National Park System. So if you want more information about that, you can just look him up online. That's Charles Young, born into slavery and then moved on up to be the first black U.S. National Park Superintendent. Okay, so now going back from history to the present time, as those of you who are regular listeners to the show know, I am currently embroiled in a battle with the city of Bowling Green. Their municipal utility is planning to fine those of us that have solar panels to the point where it's uneconomical to have solar power on our roofs. So in this battle, it's good to have actual numbers. It's good to have actual information that's been researched by a credible source that's not just all estimates and this must cost that much. And to that end, I was fortunate enough to have an interview this past week with a fella named Joshua Pearce, who is a professor at Michigan Technical University, and he has done extensive research on this question for many years, and so I was very fortunate to have an interview. So have we got the interview set? Are we ready to roll? All right, well, let's hear our interview with Joshua Pearce. Joshua Pearce, thank you very much for being on our show. Could you just repeat your name and tell us your position?
Sure. My name is Joshua Pearce. I'm the Richard Whitty Professor of Material Science and Engineering and a professor in the Department of Electrical and Computing Engineering at Michigan Tech.
Okay. Now, your article that's going to be published in the March issue of Renewables and Sustainable Energy Reviews talks about something called the value of solar, or VOS. Could you tell us what that actually means?
Great. So the value of solar is a way of economically valuing the solar electricity at a distributed generation setup of a photovoltaic system.
Great. So when you're talking value, you mean every sort of value?
Correct. And so it's a way of quantifying all the different aspects of it. So what has historically happened is at first most utilities were providing people that had solar systems on their roofs the offset generation cost. So anything that they would have paid a generator to provide electricity from some other way, they made that available to the customer. And decades ago, we knew that wasn't quite fair because there's other things that the utility is actually saving on when electricity is being provided in a distributed fashion. And so what was kind of the law of the land in the U.S. was a net metering arrangement where, if your system creates, 100 kilowatt hours and you use 100 kilowatt hours, you don't pay anything. And if you generate a little bit less than that, then you pay your normal rate. So it's kind of the net production value. And since then, we started to actually regress and go back towards not paying a full net metering rate for customers that are also generating electricity for the grid's use. And this is a highly contentious debate in the utility industry and energy policy as a whole. And so what our article did was look at a methodology to be completely fair, where we're taking every avoidable cost and finding a way to quantify it. And then an individual utility needs to plug in, like we have the equations, and they just plug in their own values for what their avoidable costs are in each of the separate sections.
Okay, so how did your team go about calculating that those values, or that true value of solar?
Yeah, so we basically broke it down into components. So the first avoidable cost is the avoided plant operation and maintenance cost, and that's a fixed cost. And then we did the avoided plant operation and maintenance variable cost, which would be, dependent upon how much electricity was generated. There's the obvious one, which is the avoided fuel cost. So, for example, if you're offsetting coal-related power, you don't need to buy coal. Then there's the avoided generation capacity cost, and solar is actually quite useful in general for offsetting some of the most expensive electricity. There's the avoided reserve capacity cost, avoided transmission capacity cost, avoided distribution capacity cost, and all of these are coming because you're providing electricity basically to your neighbors when you have a solar system put on your roof. And then there's environmental cost, and I need to be clear here that some of the major conclusions we drew from the study didn't even include these because these often aren't considered as part of the market. And then in addition, the final one is the avoided health liability costs. And so, for example, if you look at Canada, Ontario has completely shut down all their coal plants. And you can say, why would they do such a thing? And that's because the government happens to be the ones paying for healthcare for their citizens. And so they're very good about quantifying exactly how many pennies they're paying because of pollution from coal, and they could very easily see that, because they're kind of on both sides of it, that they don't want to pay that extra money for the health care, and so they just cut out the coal in order to save money for their health care. In the U.S., things are a little different, where the individuals are paying for their health care costs, and they're paying through insurance, usually or hopefully, and so the health liability costs aren't factored in the same way they are in countries that have socialized medicine. And so we put that as one of the cost savings, but when we did this final analysis on the value of solar as a whole, we didn't include those last two. And so we know that all of our results are actually exceptionally conservative because there are very real health liability costs. And as the realities of climate change become more and more clear and are more and more easy to quantify, actual carbon-related liability is also going to become, I think, something that companies are going to need to consider at their bottom line.
So Canada shut their coal plants, and they saw a decrease in health costs because people were healthier.
Exactly. Yeah, we've done an earlier study. Actually, where I got really interested in the healthcare part of it was there's been a couple fairly good studies of what the coal-related pollution costs are in the U.S., except they did it more in terms of lives. And so as a general rule, if we were to take all of our coal plants offline in the U.S. and replace them with solar-generated electricity, we would save 52,000 American lives per year. And when I wrote that paper, it seemed like that's saving a lot of human beings. In the context of the current pandemic, it doesn't seem like that large of a number, but it's still a lot of people that are dying every year because of coal-related pollution.
Oh, no, that's still a big number. I mean, I live in it.
We're getting kind of numb to the
yeah.
Our local newspaper has the number of dead in our area and in the state and in the country every day. So
right, but I live in a town called Bowling Green, and we have 30,000 people. So you're talking about more than our entire city, and half again. So wow. So all right. And you mentioned the word capacity a couple times. I think our general listeners might not know what that actually means in terms of the electrical grid. Could you try a quick definition of capacity?
Yes, so that's a good question. So basically what it is that in order for your lights to turn on when you flick a switch, you're creating a power draw. You're sucking electricity from the grid. And for your lights to actually turn on, the grid has to have the capacity to be able to handle that additional draw. And so always the supply and demand of electricity has to be exactly equivalent. And electric utilities are fantastic at doing this in general. Barring weird Texas, ice storms, in general, they're really, really good at it. And how they are able to do that is they have to have a generation capacity sort of online waiting, for that moment when you are going to flick the switch so that they can provide you the power. And those kind of spinning reserves are the most costly. And as you use more and more power, like as everybody kind of in aggregate uses more and more power, like let's say it's a very hot day in the middle of the summer and everyone's got their air conditioners on full blast, that power becomes extremely expensive. It's always like what the power at the peak is the most expensive for the utility to be able to purchase. And so they want to try to avoid those times as much as possible. And one of the real beauties of solar is that often our peak load periods when electricity is egregiously expensive is when solar is producing the most. And so all of these distributed generation systems directly help the utility's bottom line by cutting down that peak, by shaving it down.
All right. Thank you. So in your abstract, you say that grid-tied solar owners are being grossly undercompensated. And that's pretty strong language for an academic paper. So what do you mean by that exactly?
Well, we wanted to be really clear because there is a fairly substantial, I would say misinformation campaign going on in some utility areas. Now, some utilities sort of get it, and they happen to be, I would say, geographically isolated on both coasts. And so you have, utilities in California offering to put solar systems on people's homes. You've got places in Vermont where they'll actually do the whole thing for you and couple it into your bill. It might be even owned by the utility. It's not necessarily owned by the homeowner, but they're using distributed photovoltaics because it's the least cost method to provide electricity. And other utilities, I can use my own local utility as an example, haven't kind of gotten with the program. And so they, like my own local utility, is very pro-solar, but they want to have large, massive solar farms that they control. They're not as big of a fans as for distributed generation. And so they're interpreting the minimum that the Michigan requires for distributed generation as a cap that they won't go above. And it just so happens I'm in a relatively unpopulated area made up of by university, and every engineering professor I know put up solar as soon as they could because of the economics, and we wiped out our cap, and it was first set at 1%, and then we were, they redid the legislation, moved it up to 2%, and that year we wiped that out again. And so all my colleagues that don't have solar on their roofs are angry all the time because they want to get it on. And so because solar's come down so far in cost that it just makes sense for everyone. We did a study in Michigan. Every single person in Michigan would make money putting solar on their roof as long as they weren't, heavily shaded or, in the bottom of a gully or something. And so the utility sees that as a threat to their kind of business model, and they're making the claim that solar homeowners are costing their other users additional money. And that is definitely not true. And what we did in this study was break apart each of these costs, quantify what they would be for an example, kind of like a representative utility. And it doesn't mean that a specific utility will get the same numbers as we did, but we did sensitivities on all of those values to pick out what variables within the value of the avoided costs mattered, and then which of the avoided costs mattered the most. And so the company, or the study, goes into enormous detail on how all those values are found. And the bottom line, when you look at everything and all the sensitivities, is that the avoided cost is much higher than the net metering cost for all the places that we looked at. And when you start factoring in some of the higher cost escalation for O&M, say for a standard like coal or natural gas power plant, when you start putting those numbers in, it just makes it even worse. And so taking even relatively conservative values, I can kind of very, very authoritatively say that if utilities are using a net metering scheme, people with solar are actually subsidizing their neighbors. And that is not something that is I would say is well known.
So the utilities, when they discourage solar, are not only hurting those of us that want to have solar on our roofs, they're actually hurting their own bottom line too.
Well, they're hurting their own bottom line, but they're also hurting all their other customers. They're basically forcing their other customers to pay more for electricity. And if you think about it, when you buy electricity, what are you paying for? You're paying for the infrastructure that the utility put in and the fuel that they're using to do it and their labor costs. And if say you put solar on the roof of your house, you've just paid for some of the infrastructure for the utility for them. You give it to them for free, and so they don't have to get financing for it. They don't have to do anything. It's all on you. And so the idea that you would somehow be costing your neighbors money because you invested in an asset to create electricity for everybody is just ludicrous.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. When you put it like that, I guess those of us that have solar are actually just giving our electricity to the utility and saying, "Here, you can sell this."
Right. And many places, and I don't know about Bowling Green specifically, but if you're providing your electricity to the grid and they're doing anything even remotely close to net metering, and I know they've since changed their rules to make it much, much less than net metering. The time of use value of that electricity that you're getting from solar is much higher than the average. And again, it's because it does peak saving in general. And so you can more or less count on solar always doing a good bit of peak shaving during the summer.
So I know you're not terribly familiar with Bowling Green's proposed fees on solar, but from what you've heard, what's your impression about?
I saw that they were charging a set fee for the privilege to have a solar integrated system, and I don't recall exactly what that was, but the idea that the whole idea of a set fee is ludicrous, because most solar systems, in fact, I guess almost all, there might be a couple exceptions out there, but almost all solar systems are set up to do you're looking to be net zero by the end of the year. That's as big as people generally put in their own PV systems. And so in most cases you're actually less than that, and I know for many people they end up using more electricity with time, so they might have designed it for net zero, but then they end up buying more grid electricity than they're producing with their solar panels. Those people are definitely providing a net benefit to the utility, and the idea that they're using the grid without paying for the electricity of it. You could, a good analogy would be someone, say, putting in LED lighting in their house. And so you put in a PV system and you're going to decrease the load, how much electricity you're buying from the grid. And that's going to decrease the revenue for the utility. Well, if you put in LED lighting in your house, you'll also do the exact same thing. And if you went around and did every energy efficiency thing that you could do at an average house, you'd probably get to a load reduction around where kind of a typical solar system also reduces the load to the grid. And so no one thinks it would be even remotely fair to penalize people for putting LEDs in their house just to save electricity. But that's what that legislation basically does. And that the same way, or not legislation, the rules for the utility, but the same way that the utilities charge on a per monthly basis also penalizes people that are more efficient or doing distributed generation. I know utility around here, you pay $10 a month to be connected to the grid, and then you pay for your usage after that. But that $10 a month basically means that if you use less electricity, your average cost per kilowatt hour, especially if you're a low user, is much higher than someone that uses a lot. And in my view, that's not even remotely fair. And there have been many engineers that have been arguing about this for decades now. And one of the ways you can discourage energy efficiency is to put more and more costs on that kind of monthly charge instead of on the actual usage charge.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, so you said that nationally it's kind of a mix. Some utilities are encouraging rooftop solar, and some are actively discouraging it, I guess. Could you see a trend, or is it so mixed up that it's hard to? I think the utilities that are in trouble are discouraging it, and let me
preface that solar is so inexpensive at this point that, I haven't run every single house in America, but I can say with pretty good assurance that at net metering rates, it's probably less expensive for you to put in solar than to buy grid electricity. And we did a study in our area because of this kind of artificial cap that was put on systems where people would definitely, save quite a bit of money. They would make double-digit returns with solar systems. But they're not allowed to do it. Basically, you're not allowed to get an interconnection agreement. And so we were curious about, we're in the kind of pretty far north, it's almost a tundra, but not quite a tundra. It does thaw usually in the summer. And in our region, over 70% of the people that lived here within the next couple of years will be able to economically leave the grid. And so if utilities, either by manipulation of rates or by just having flat out not allowing you to do an interconnection agreement with a photovoltaic grid tied system, what will happen is their customers will just leave them, and then that will increase the cost for everybody. So there's been a couple nice studies in places like Arizona and Hawaii, New Jersey, where it's much easier to have an off-grid system where you basically just have batteries and the photovoltaic panels and you're covered. In our region, you can't do that because we simply don't have that much solar flux in the winter. And so what we did is we said, we'll during those times, we'll put in a cogen unit. And so the capital cost for that system is huge. You got to have a pretty good set of batteries, you got a cogen unit and the PV, but it still turns out that it's less expensive than buying grid electricity up here. And I think the risk of these utilities that are sort of not changing their business model and figuring out how to work with their customers, if they see their customers as a threat or as competition, they're mean to them by charging them outrageous fees or not allowing them to produce their own less costly electricity, they're going to lose their customers. I think doing a cogen unit, that's still a pretty big step forward. I mean, there's not that many cogens in the U.S. and places like Japan and Europe, they're much more popular. But I think we're going to see that technology coming online fairly quickly. And for places that are easier, basically like the whole South and West, battery costs have now come down far enough that having a reasonable battery backup PV system is not that big of a deal anymore. Whereas, even 10 years ago, that was, prohibitively expensive.
So writing on the wall there for the utilities. How big a part can rooftop solar play in helping us eliminate carbon pollution?
It can actually do quite a bit. So if you look at the net energy of a PV system, and let's say we take Detroit, which is sort of average America, but not overly good solar flux, the half a roof on the average house in Detroit would provide all of its electricity needs averaged throughout the year. And the system would pay for itself energetically within about a year. And so
wow.
It's warranted for 20 to 25, and we know it'll last longer than that. So we know that these things are tremendous net energy producers, and that means tremendous net carbon pollution reducers.
Oh, that's great. So what kind of advice would you give to somebody who's considering putting on rooftop solar?
So I would, for everyone, basically, I would say if you've got access to capital and a roof that is unshaded or a backyard that's unshaded, somewhere to put some panels, you should look into it just purely on economic grounds alone, let alone climate change and reduction of pollution and avoided healthcare problems for your fellow citizens. Most places in the U.S. you can do it now. Not everybody has full net metering, but most utilities still have something that's close to full net metering. Like they might not give you credits that you earned in kind of year one passing over to year two, but they'll kind of even up with you every month. And so there's any situation like that, you're going to almost certainly be an economic winner. If you don't have access to capital, like let's say you just bought a house and you don't have any funds left, your mortgage is as high as it's going to get, there are several companies that will pay for everything for you. And if you're lucky enough to be in one of the regions that they're covering, they'll come to your house, they'll do the engineering design, they'll build the system, they'll pay for it all, and then, let's say your monthly bills were $50 a month, your monthly bills get dropped down to $40 a month, and the little bit of extra, they'll still be pulling pulling profit off of that, like you won't get as much profit as if you would have if you had been able to fund it yourself. But you'll still be making out. My general rule is that you should try to get 3 quotes from local installers on what the system actually is, and what the cost is, and what they think it can perform. And then, don't trust anyone. The U.S. government has a really nice website called PV Watts, where you can punch in your address, trace out like how big you want the solar array to be, like on the roof of your own house. It has like a satellite map of it. And then it'll run the basic calculations for how much energy it thinks that you're going to produce and how much money you think you're going to be able to save based on your the rates that you're paying for your own local electric utility. And if those numbers are, ballpark to what you're seeing from the actual quotes, you can believe that they're real. If the quotes are coming in that, you're going to save $1 million, spend $1 million, something's wrong. But I think this is the time to do it. You do need to be aware, I guess, that the legislation can change. Normally, they grandfather existing PV systems into whatever the regulations were when you did it, but they don't have to do that. They have control. I know for the system that I have on my house, just in case they did that, I made my system so that it is kind of battery ready. And so if the rules change and it's no longer profitable for me to have solar on my roof, I'll simply put in a battery system and a cogen unit and kind of be off to the races. But I think it's a better idea. It's more responsible if we share the solar electricity and have a distributed generation-based grid. It's more resilient, it costs less, and it's better for the environment.
That's pretty much all we got time for. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, it's really good to talk to you. I hope the kind of political situation in Bowling Green fixes itself, and that the local utility finds a way that they can take advantage of some of the value of distributed solar, maybe possibly by renting or owning, like renting roof space or owning the PV system, so that they're more comfortable with the business model, particularly for people that don't have access to the capital.
That is a good idea. All right. Well, thanks so much, Joshua, and we will keep fighting that battle down there in Bowling Green. So, some excellent information there from Joshua Pearce, and what he was saying, it all makes common sense. It doesn't just. It's not just right. It feels right, doesn't it? That having people generate power right where it's being used is going to be saving you lots of money and even saving the utilities money. So many environmental issues are like that the common sense matches the reality, and yet we still get policies getting put into place which just fly in the face of that common sense, and the justifications used for those policies are just really flimsy. They don't hold up when you look at them, and this, no exception here. But I do have an exceptional co-host. Rebecca, are you still on the line?
I am still, yes.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Welcome aboard.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we get to hear from our wonderful sponsors. We get to hear from the Wood County Park District. And the Wood County Park District is a natural resources conservation agency. They protect natural spaces, maintain quality green spaces, provide engaging programming, and they teach people to love and respect nature. They restore wildlife habitats, and they lead outdoor adventures. The Wood County Parks protects natural spaces in Wood County for all to enjoy from 8 a.m. to 30 minutes past sunset every day of the year. And there's several ways to get a hold of them. One is to just call them at 419-353-1897. That's 419-353-1897. You can go to their website, wcparks.org. They have a nifty app you can download. You go to any app store and search for WC Parks. And, of course, they're on Instagram, Twitter, and other social media platforms. Now, there's a couple of actual things I'd like to announce from the Wood County Park District, and this is in the way of public announcements. And if you have an environmental organization and you have any activity that you're doing and you want it broadcast on the air, just contact us at joe@joedemare4agreenfuture.org, and most likely we will read it. One interesting thing is that the Wood County Park District in the next couple weeks is going to be conducting prescribed fires on several park properties. Specifically they're looking at the Bradner Preserve and the Rudolph Savannah area. So if you're out walking in those parks and you see fire, don't panic. It's something that they're planning to do. And fire is an extremely important part of managing an ecosystem, of having it stay natural, because it eliminates invasive species. It releases nutrients into the ground. It clears the area so that it's not all choked out with weeds and wildlife can get through it. Native Americans were using fire extensively before the Europeans got here as a management tool to keep the land fertile and to keep the game plentiful. And the fact that it was so fertile and plentiful when the Europeans got here is a testament to how effective fire burning is. So that's something to look for. And then I also wanted to mention the Wood County Parks District has this Go Green Passport. And it's a cool thing. You go to the website, wcparks.org, and you print it off, and it lists all the parks in the Wood County, so you can get stamps. You stamp your passport at the park as you visit each one. And then it's also got a whole bunch of green activities you can do and your family, like planting native trees and plants, food matters, shopping wisely, conserving and protecting water, conserving energy use. And it's got all kinds of little activities under each of these that you can, when you do them, you stamp your own passport. And then once you've accumulated some stamps, you don't have to get the whole thing completely stamped. Every time you visit 3 parks and do 3 of the action items per category and the passport, you can bring your passport to the Wood County Parks District headquarters, and they have some nice prizes for you. You can get some travel pouches, or you can get some things that have little camping kits that have forks and knives and spoons in them. It's just a nice, fun thing to do, especially if you're, like so many people, still quarantined. You can just print out this passport at home. It's something to do with the kids, and it's a way to get out of the house. And we know getting out of the house is extremely important, especially in this time of when we've all sort of been on house arrest for so long. But so that's the Wood County Park District. All right. So, Rebecca, this has been kind of a history-heavy episode of For a Green Future, but I think you have a little more history you could lay on us. Is that correct?
Well, kind of, yeah. As you know, Teddy Roosevelt, we just had President's Day. I thought I'd do everybody's favorite environmentalist president. He's famous for dramatically expanding the national parks and forests, including several really major, internationally famous parks. He has a couple smaller ones, though, actually a national park and a national monument that are actually named after him, and I thought it'd be cool to do those, which are not quite as famous. The first one, Teddy Roosevelt National Park, is in North Dakota. It's got buttes. Now, there's an idea. It's been compared to the Badlands, like sort of a smaller version of the Badlands. Someday I'm going to have to do buttes versus mesas, know the difference, because I'm a little shaky on that. But it's apparently got prairie dogs, bison, wild horses, elk, and deer. In fact, on one of the hiking trails, and they have hiking and horse trails at 3 different levels of difficulty. But one of them leads to his Theodore Roosevelt's personal cabin that you can go see. And also people really, really in the reviews seem to like the Prairie Dog Towns. They're just off one of the major trails that you can go to. Apparently their little squeaks and whistles have been described as adorable. It's got something called the Painted Painted Canyon, which sounds nice. And there's this poster about how to safely pet a buffalo, describing the various parts of a buffalo's body and whether or not you should touch them. Spoiler alert, you really shouldn't. You just shouldn't. It's a bad idea. All of them are off limits, basically. But yeah, so that sounds kind of nice. And also, there's this really cool sounding thing called the Theodore Roosevelt Island in Washington, D.C., it turns out. It's a national memorial. It's located, it's 88.5 acres, located in the middle of the Potomac River in the Chesapeake Bay estuary. And it was authorized in 1932. Somebody donated the land, and Congress authorized it. And then in 1960, they found funding for it, so that was good. It's maintained by the National Park Service. It has a lot of little trails, apparently. There are no cars or bicycles allowed, and it's accessed via a footbridge from Arlington, Virginia. Originally, it was named the Acostine Island by the Nacotchtank tribe, used for farmland and retreats for rich guys at various times. It was interestingly, speaking of the Buffalo Soldiers, it was a Civil War training camp for Buffalo Soldiers during the Civil War. It's been restored from the farmland to something like the original forest. It also has woodlands and swamp areas, and the monument itself was created by Eric Googler, architect, and Paul Manship, sculptor. And it's kind of a sort of a bunch of obelisks or something with plaques with various quotes of Theodore Roosevelt's, and it's separated from the Virginia Bank by something called the Little River, which is like a little channel that separates it from that. It has apparently a great view of the Potomac Gorge, the Key Bridge, Georgetown, Rosslyn, and Kennedy Center. So I want to go there now next time I'm in D.C., although apparently you can't really get there from D.C. You got to go to Virginia. So that's a problem.
Yeah, I never heard of it.
Yeah, me neither. It just sounds really beautiful, though. It sounds like he is the best national memorial.
Yeah, well, he deserved it. He earned it. He was a good president in terms of the environment. All right, that's great. So another Becca destination to mark on your maps there. So
indeed,
right.
You see, somebody needs to give us a grant to report live from all these places, don't you think?
Definitely, yeah. I'll start looking for a grant like that.
Yeah.
All right. So now it's not too late for you folks to join us at 866-240-1065. Have you ever visited this national monument that Rebecca, or the park, or the memorial that Rebecca's talking about, or what did you think of the interview in terms of what Bowling Green is trying to do to Rooftop Solar? Give us a call at 866-240-1065. Does this make sense to you, or are you like, what the heck is going on there? Be happy to talk to you about it. And now I'm happy to talk to you about environmental news, ecological news. And the first couple stories are in the form of updates. One very sad update, as we reported last week, Wisconsin had a wolf season. They were forced to open up wolf season because the Wisconsin State Legislature has said that as soon as the wolves were taken off the Endangered Species Act, they had to establish a wolf season and allow hunting. And they opened it up on Monday, and by Wednesday morning, the hunters had exceeded the quotas by more than half again. In other words, once they let those bloodthirsty hunters loose on the wolves, in less than 2 days, they killed many, many more wolves than the quota was supposed to establish. And so the wolf population of Minnesota, over the space of 2 days, took a tremendous hit. They had to close the season. They opened it up Monday morning, and at 4 p.m. Wednesday, they closed it because those, with the high-powered rifles, with the optics people have, with infrared sensors, with drones, with all the technology people have now, it's really no longer what you would call a sport. Now it's more like a video game that you can just go, and you're no longer sort of pitting your wits against a prey that has a fairly good chance of beating you. It's more like, pushing buttons. And basically they proved by this wolf hunt that it's incredibly lopsided now. You have to wonder how much quote unquote honor or accomplishment there is in overcoming a prey that when it's so easy and the technology is so advanced, and the poor wolves, all they have are their senses. So it's just a terrible thing that Wisconsin just did to their wolf population. But they're planning to do even more terrible things in the future because there were about 1,200 wolves in the wild in Wisconsin. After the 2-day hunt, that's down to less than 1,000, brought down to about 900. But it turns out that their number that they're literally shooting for, is 350, which is...
What?
It's an insanely small population, much too small to maintain itself genetically. Just a crazy number. So essentially, the state of Wisconsin is set to exterminate wolves, and it took.
Do they know what happens when they get rid of a major predator of bunnies and rats?
Yeah, well, the people at the DNR know this, but the politicians and the hunters apparently don't. I was just thinking about this. It took us literally decades to teach people that wolves aren't these horrible, bloodthirsty carnivores that need to be exterminated. I mean, it took decades to teach people that, and yet in the course over a few years, that all that seems to have been reversed. So it's pretty sad, and hopefully Biden will reestablish endangered species protection because they're obviously extremely endangered. All right, well, we got to move on. More. What? Yeah, he's the hope for the wolves. So let's see what he does. Go ahead and
spring into action there.
Yeah. All right. Another update. I don't know if you heard last week's show when we were talking about the subpolar gyre. I mispronounced gyre. And I also got one fact in that a little bit confused, and that was that the gyre apparently is actually a point of upwelling, but everything else in that story is accurate. The water from the Gulf Stream is supposed to flow up past the gyre into the North Sea, where it goes down, where it gets salty and cold and sinks, ideally. But after we did our report, I don't know if you saw, but headlines in all kinds of news outlets all this past week was reporting what we had reported, and that is that the climate change and the water coming off the Greenland ice sheets seems to be slowing that conveyor down. And as I reported, if it stops, the Atlantic Ocean can literally die. All the living things in it will die from lack of nutrients. So a little bit of update there. A news story: Alberta has the Alberta tar sands, and are this place where it's a completely dead landscape where they're mining sand, washing this oil off of it, and then dumping the toxic residue into this incredible lake. And that lake turns out to be the largest man-made object on the planet surface. It's more than 30 square miles, and it's visible from space, and it's absolutely toxic. Anything that lands in it or tries to drink it, dead. And what the story I wanted to report on, there's two aspects. One, in 2020, the Native Americans and the environmentalists in the region had been saying for decades, hey, this stuff is leaking out of this toxic lake into the groundwater and into the river. And the Canadian government was like, oh, is it? I don't know. I guess we better do a study. And they took about 10 years, but they finally did admit in their study, oh, yeah, it is leaking. And that came out in 2020. And what happened is that rather than try to fix the problem, the province of Alberta was taken over by science and climate denying conservatives who are blaming all the concern, and this is the news story, it was reported in the Narwhal, they're blaming all the concern on out of the country activists trying to meddle in Canadian politics. I mean, does this sound familiar? This
Which
is
would
what
not actually make it a bad idea, even if it was true.
Yeah, and if it were true, like, so what? But it's not true. The Canadian, and the other thing, of course, is that the destruction of Canada is being funded by out of country places, especially Exxon. All right, so let's see here. That's about it for this show. We're running out of time. So
Ready.
Yeah, it's walleye season. You know, this is the time to get out there and do some fishing. And even though it's kind of a gray, cold day today, it's still a good day to get outside, as any day is. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of the show. It's been a pleasure. This is Joe DeMare.
And Rebecca Wood.
And we are signing off.
Bye-bye.
Time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia